Welcome to our WebNet meeting for June. This is the last meeting of the 09-10 season. Sorry, I work for Cal Performances and we run by season. So this is the last meeting. We usually reserve it for accessibility and for Lucy's group. So without further ado, I'm going to get started with some introductions. The first I was offered the opportunity to just give a little bit of history of WebNet. WebNet's been around for about 13 years, and it is a group of volunteers who produce a meeting every other month on topics that are generally of interest to web developers on campus. It doesn't have to be necessarily someone who works directly with web editing. It could be a programmer who's doing applications programming. It could be someone who's doing writing for the web. It could be a graphic designer. We have, like I said, meetings every other month, and then in addition to those meetings, the general WebNet meetings, which you are all here for, we have every other month on the off months a meeting for a special interest group for WebNet editors, so that is a different subgroup of this group. There are, I don't know, 6 of us who are on the steering committee for WebNet. We determine what topics are going to be available each year, and then we set up the schedule and invite you all to come and listen to presenters and panelists. So, my name is Lynn Zumo. I don't think I said that. My name is Lynn Zumo. I am the new technology coordinator for Cal Performances, and I am on the steering committee for WebNet. So, this is, like I said, we usually reserve the last meeting of the year for accessibility, and this is the 4th time that we have done a meeting with Lucy's group. So I'm really pleased that we were able to do this for the campus. It seems to be a really hot topic, and so anyway, I'm going to introduce Lucy Greco, and I am really happy that she's available to do these kind of meetings for us. Oh, by the way, there's going to be a sign-in sheet that comes around. I forgot to mention that. So please write down your name and email address and whatever else it asks for on that. She is one of the leaders of the campus WebNet, or the campus web access group, and the access technology specialist for the Center for Disabled Students. Lucy?
Thank you, Lynn. I'm very proud to be here today, and I'm actually very proud to work at Berkeley as the assistive technology specialist, because I see this room full of people, and everybody here is here to talk about accessibility. I have never, ever been rejected when I go to people and talk to them about accessibility on this campus. People are always very interested, very happy about accessibility, and even people who say, oh, I don't know if this is accessible or not, and I'm really worried about it, really have done a good job, because they've at least got that niggling in their mind and they've taken the first step and come to ask about accessibility. So I want everybody to give Berkeley a round of applause for having a great accessibility environment. So to give a little bit of history of Web Access was formed 5.5 years ago as a group of people interested in forming a policy on campus about technology in general and accessibility primarily for that technology. And they met for about 5 or 6 months and worked on kind of a draft policy, which continued over the next year, year and a half, and actually got forwarded to the Office of the President as a system-wide policy. It got denied, I'm sad to say, but that denial was not, we're not interested in having a policy on accessibility. We just don't know where the funding is going to come from to sponsor that policy. So we kind of stepped back for a bit, and the Office of the President said the campuses need to take responsibility, and that's where we come in, because Berkeley is currently ahead of every other campus in its accessibility initiatives. Our Web Access group now runs clinics once a week, where somebody can request a clinic for any website they want that they're working on, or any web application they're working on. It doesn't even have to be a web, it just needs to be something that is computer related. Bring it into the group, and we run it through a screen reader. We have experts who are in the room who look at the coding, look at how the page is laid out, and try and figure out ways to make that website more accessible and inevitably more usable. We had a build grant 2 years ago, which the build grant, how many of you are familiar with that? Is the Berkeley Inclusion and Leadership Diversity Grant, where we actually went out and specifically worked on a couple of staff websites to make them more accessible, which was very successful. And now we've done so many websites in the clinic environment that I've been going through and trying to actually catalog all the websites we've done, and I've lost count. So on the sign-up sheet, there's a slot there for people who might want to bring their website or application to us for a web review. Please put yes on the sign-up sheet, and we will contact you, and you will get a chance to fill it out, or go through a web client application review. Let's see, I think I didn't miss anything. I would like to recognize all the Web Access members in the room. If you could all stand, please. Hopefully I didn't miss anybody as they walked in. We have John Hayes from ETS, Steve McConnell from the News Center, Karen F. from Office of the CIO, Kim Steinbacher from, what is your department nowadays? Equity and Inclusion. Okay. Did I miss anybody? Caroline Boyden, my co-lead, the most important person. My co-lead from Office of Letters and Sciences. And I wouldn't be able to do Web Access without her, because I may know how the screen reader works, but she knows how the coding works. I now would like to hand over the meeting to Shel Wagner, our Assistant Vice Chancellor of Information Technology and the campus CIO, who has been our biggest supporter and our strongest mainstay. When we go to Shel and say something is wrong, we need accessibility in something, he has never turned us away. He has always helped us. He has always sponsored us. In fact, he is sponsoring this session today. He is the one doing the recording of this session so that we can post it on the web and have it archived for posterity. So Shel, I'm turning it over to you, and thank you very much for moderating our panel.
Thank you very much, Lucy. And I think we should all start by putting our hands together in a special round of applause for Lucy for all of her personal efforts to make all of this happen. You know, one of the things that makes Berkeley such a special place is people's passion for lots and lots of topics. And this is one that I think there's a large number of individuals on the campus who feel very passionate about. We have but 3 panelists today, but I think we could have had a whole table full of panelists of people who really care about this subject. But I'm excited to be able to present the panelists today and hopefully have a real interactive dialogue with all of you on where we see web access, web technologies, accessibility playing a role today and going in the future, and where you see the needs, and hopefully you'll have some good questions and we can play Stump the Panelists a little bit as well. Starting to my left, our first panelist is John Myers. John is an accessibility expert with the Center for Accessible Technologies. It's a local nonprofit group organization that, amongst other things, provides consulting services to corporations, libraries, governments to help them on creating accessible websites. Welcome, John. Our next panelist is Tom Holub. Tom's the Director of Computing for the College of Letters and Sciences here on the campus. He first joined the LNS Computing Resource Team in the desktop world in 1995, and then eventually, letting no good deed go unpunished, was promoted into management over time and took responsibility for that group in 2000 and has held that role as director of the Letters and Sciences Computing since August of 2000. He's very active in quite a few committees on campus and cares deeply about delivering solutions through technologies to everyone in all of our communities on campus. He's also the co-chair of the IT Managers Forum to provide a forum for IT managers to address these issues. So welcome, Tom. And our final panelist is Bill Allison. Bill is a senior manager within Berkeley's IST Information Services and Technology Group. Bill runs the Web Applications Unit for that group and provides expert application support and leadership in a number of areas, including open source development. Not just on central or enterprise-wide applications, but also on departmental and locally developed applications. And he, again, is an active participant in many campus communities, not the least of which is his current role as chair of the ITAC, or Architecture Committee for Information Technology. He's also participated extensively in our security committees, in our roadmap work. So welcome, Bill Ellison. And I'm here as a moderator today, not as an expert in web accessibility, or even, I'm sad to say today, an expert in application development as I atrophy my skills by the day. But I was in a past life an application developer as well as a system administrator, and I've worked in technology for many, many years. And one of the things that is important about this subject to me is the challenge of change. We often think in terms of solving a problem is an event. It's a one-time thing. And if we could just get that website to be accessible today, it would solve the problem. I think as technologists, one of the things that we are trained to realize is that the half-life of a solution is getting shorter every year. Whatever work you put in today, you should expect it will only be around as long as that technology is prevalent. And in fact, the ability to decide what is going to be prevalent no longer rests with the CIO or with the technology managers or the leaders. It actually rests with every individual, an individual's choice. That presents an enormous challenge for creating experiences that are accepting of all communities. You can imagine if you solve a problem like accessibility in an enterprise application, and you work very hard to make that work for all communities, you could expect to live with that for 2, 3, 4, 5 years. Creating an application today, you may need to create an application that's only going to be around for 60 days or 30 days. And it's possible to do that by the nature of the underlying infrastructure that exists today. Many companies don't even have IT departments. They have people that are putting solutions together from other technology organizations, cloud computing, consulting firms, et cetera. So there's a very dynamic environment going on. And a lot of that is being infused today with an almost inexorable march towards immersion technologies, full multimedia and rich user experience that creates particular challenges for accessibility. In many cases, we have websites that are presenting content that are not able to be converted into accessible formats and profiles. It isn't just a visual, it's audio, it's color, it's all kinds of aspects of those presentations that are particularly challenging for us because the devices, the tools that are being developed on a daily basis want to push the edge of what those technologies can do. I think many of you would have heard or saw the iPhone 4 announcement yesterday. Not the least of which in the myriad of Steve Jobs pontificating about, waxing poetically about his wonderful device, but he did in fact break ground on something that we've been waiting for since the Jetsons, and the ability to have full video conferencing and video phone calls, one-to-one and potentially over time one-to-many, in a personal device. I was moving a machine at my home the other day out of the garage, and it occurred to me that my little phone device here has more memory, 10 times, and a faster processor, more than 10 times, than that PC had that needed wheels that weighed so much when I went to move it. So what does that do for application development for us? Everything is going mobile. Everything is going multimedia. So all of the work in web accessibility from, say, 5 years ago when Lucy and team started Web Access to create a policy, in many cases, one of the challenges is those policies become outdated because they're written about specific technologies. For those of you that don't know, we have a huge problem with content today for educational content. Many of the federal legislative statutes that are on the books assume that all that content was in books. So what do to make them accessible? They say, okay, yes, for no cost, you can cut the spine off the book and feed it into a scanner. Is that the most arcane thing you've ever heard of? Right? The publishers will not give us the electronic text in all cases, but they'll give us a book which we can cut the spine off and feed into a scanner to convert it into machine-readable format so that then we can have it available for accessibility purposes. The world is moving much faster than many business models, many laws, and many policies. So my role is to ensure that Berkeley is keeping up with the world, or in many cases leading it where we can. I do serve on a committee for the system on accessibility and have done so on and off for the last several years, and I'm happy to say that we are reinvigorating that effort at the system-wide level because we still believe, in spite of the perceived unfunded mandate of designing for accessibility, that it is really a requirement that we set standards by which there are appropriate expectations for the delivery of our content, our scholarly experience to the world needs to be made accessible to all communities. And so we need to make sure that we're keeping up with those policies. So that's a little bit of my background and what I've been working on. I think it wouldn't happen, again, without people with a passion for this. And I've learned a lot from our web access group, and I hope I can learn a lot today as well. So again, I'd encourage you to ask questions as we go. We're going to give each of the panelists the opportunity to speak about their areas of expertise, what they're working on, their specific challenges that they're dealing with, and what their focuses are, and then we will also be able to intersperse some questions throughout that, so feel free to ask during the session. But we left time at the end as well for anyone to take the discussion in a direction that's most appropriate for you. So why don't we start with John? I'll turn to John and ask him about really the history of your organization. I think the Center for Accessible Technologies has a great name. What's its real mission and its focus, and how did you get involved with Berkeley?
Sure. Well, first of all, thanks for inviting me here. It's a pleasure and an honor to be here. And a little bit about C4AT, which is the acronym we go by. We've been around for about 25 years. We're a nonprofit based in Berkeley. And we were the first assistive technology center in the country. Assistive Technology Center is basically a place or an organization that connects people with assistive technology that will help them do their everyday tasks, whether it be for work or for home life or that sort of thing. And we think of assistive technology broadly, so not necessarily high-tech devices, but if you think about someone who has dexterity difficulties with their hand and holding a pencil is challenging, then wrapping a bunch of rubber bands around the pencil is a form of assistive technology. So we sort of expand that to everything we do. So we're looking for the best fit for clients, and our clients tend to usually be, they range the whole gamut of age ranges, so from little kids who are in preschool who maybe haven't learned to talk yet or something like that and are trying to communicate with their parents to tell them they're hungry, to seniors who are aging perfectly normally but are having vision problems and that sort of thing. So we work a lot with schools, and we work a lot with the Department of Rehab on helping people find solutions to technology. In the last 5 or 6 years, we started getting requests to look at the accessibility of people's websites. And for the past 5 years, we've been pretty heavily involved in that. And I was asked to talk today about our experience working with corporations and sort of how you get them to think about accessibility and work on it and keep working on it after you're done working with them. But first, I think it's worth saying a little bit about our organizational philosophy around web accessibility. We do this work because we're trying to help people, not punish people. So we try to avoid the sort of being the dentist of the web accessibility world. So you sort of, you have a problem, or you think you might have a problem, but you don't really want to go talk to anyone about it because you're afraid of what the dentist might say or how they might make you feel, or in our case that we might, call the lawyers on you or something. So we try to avoid that approach 100%. So we look at this as a collaborative process with the organizations we work with. And some of them do come to us because they are being sued by someone else or threatened to be sued by someone else for not providing equal access. But our relationship with them is more about how can we actually improve this so that it's working for people. Another piece of our philosophy is that we share the view that Shell articulated well, which is there is no such thing as a 100% accessible web page or web application, because the moment you get there, the technology changes, or the way users interact with it changes, or there's always a user or a situation that you didn't think of. So we don't think of it as some sort of end goal that you're striving for, but a process that is always part of your development and always part of your planning and design. The other big piece is that we see accessibility as not something that is an add-on or a separate set, but a subset of usability. So one of the comments we hear a lot is, well, we don't, our audience doesn't include any people with disabilities. Or, well, you know, we haven't gotten any complaints, so we know it's fine. So first of all, that's probably not true that your audience doesn't include anyone with disabilities, but more importantly, or as importantly, is that making your website more accessible tends to help all users. There are certain instances where there are specific things you do, maybe technical aspects of your coding or something that are for a very particular type of disability. But for the most part, the things that you do for making your website accessible apply to everyone. So a good example is a video. So we always say, well, you should caption your video, provide a transcript, because not everyone's going to be able to actually see the video. So everyone always thinks of blind users and deaf users, or people who are hard of hearing. But the reality is that a lot of people benefit from having closed captions or transcripts. Like, I'm sure all of you are going to watch the video of this panel over and over and over again, and your coworkers in the cubes next to you or the desks next to you are going to get tired of hearing my voice over and over again, and so you're going to want to have another way to watch it. So a lot of people benefit from that type of, if you call it an accommodation, but really it's applicable to everyone. And then the last piece of what we do, I sort of mentioned this when I was talking about the pencil analogy, but is to try to expand people's view of who the audience really is, or who is benefiting from the accessibility improvements that you might make. Depending on the study or survey you read, you'll hear that maybe between 10 and 20% of the population has some sort of disability. And if you look at the 2000 census, I think it's 19.3% of all people have a permanent or long-term disability that affects their daily life. So that's a pretty high number, and that's way less than the actual number, because there are lots of people who functionally are similar, have similar functional limitations, but would never classify themselves as having a disability. Some of your parents might fall into that category, where they're, like I said, you're aging perfectly normally, but your vision or your hearing or something else may be functionally identical to someone who classifies themselves as having a disability. The other great thing about disability is that it's one of the few protected classes that anyone can enter. So you can become disabled at any moment. And so when people say, well, we don't have any visitors to our site who are disabled, that tomorrow you could have a whole lot, depending on what happens tonight. So this is sort of a, you know, a morbid kind of way of looking at it. But you know, if you're riding your bike and you break your arm and you are in a sling for a few weeks, all of a sudden you can't press Control-Alt-Delete at the same time, and you can't, maybe it's your mouse hand, and so you can't use your mouse, you have to use your mouse with your other hand and then type with that hand. Well, you're probably, if that's a few weeks, you're probably not thinking of yourself as a person with a disability. You're probably thinking, well, I'm hurt and I'll get better and this is a pain. But functionally, it's identical to someone who doesn't have a hand. So the point of all this is that this impacts a lot of people, probably more than you can really even imagine. And so a lot of what we do is convincing people that this is actually true. And what we've been doing for the last 3 years or so is we partnered with the California Emerging Technology Fund, which is a foundation set up by the merger of PacBell and SBC, I think, that basically is trying to spend down the money they were given as part of that merger to improve broadband access for underserved groups in California. And so one of the underserved groups is people with disabilities. And so what we've been doing is through our partnership, we're able to provide no-cost technical assistance to organizations interested in improving their accessibility. It's actually a lot like your web access group. And it's a pretty rare thing that you can get free sort of professional consulting on accessibility. So that's a great resource that you have, but we're trying to extend that to other organizations. So the basic model is an organization can come to us and we'll review their site and invite them in to see people who are blind or can't use a mouse or deaf using their site, so they can sort of see, wow, that's pretty serious. We need to make some changes. And then we help them along with those changes. So they get, what they get out of it is some free help and learning how to start and how to think about this. And some help writing guidelines that will extend after we're done working with them. And what we get out of it is a chance to spread it to large corporations that otherwise might not have the time or inclination or money to get started on it. And we can also, we give them recognition at an annual awards dinner, which helps us increase the whole issue of accessibility in general. So, for instance, last year we worked with Intel, BART, TechSoup. We've worked with Gap in the past. So by saying, look, these organizations are doing this, they're small and large organizations, a lot of the arguments about we don't have the money or the time are, don't have to be a block to doing anything at all. So we try to show them how to get started and continue that work. And so what are the benefits? Well, I mentioned a few of them already. Additional ones are, I think the biggest one absolutely is you have a larger potential audience. If you've never heard a complaint about your site being inaccessible, it may be because no one knows how to contact you. And so if you said to most people, well, there's potentially 10 to 20, maybe as high as 40 or 50% of people out there who can't use your site, they would drop everything and say, well, this is a totally untapped resource for us, whether it's customers or prospective students or whatever your situation is. That technique does not tend to work very well because it is so hard to quantify the size of that market. So it's easy for me to say, well, the census says 19.3% and that sort of thing. But for some reason, people have a hard time actually saying, wow, that's really big. Because you tend to think, well, things are fine, and so this is kind of a big issue. But the fact is, it is a much larger potential audience. The other thing is that it doesn't do any harm, and it doesn't have to cost a lot of money. So we hear all the time, well, I don't want to have just a plain text site. We need JavaScript, and we need video on our site. Well, accessibility has a hard time keeping up with the latest standards and the latest technologies, but it's definitely possible, and there are lots of people all over the world working on this all the time. So you can have a very nice, attractive site that even can use Ajax and all sorts of things and still make it really accessible. It's just a matter of learning how to do it. Another thing is we often see that sites have improved search engine rankings after they've made their site accessible. This is another one that's very appealing to companies, but also very hard to quantify because it sort of depends on how bad it was when you started. So it's not easy to say, well, you'll move up 4 places on Google for your preferred keywords or something like that. But all of the things that tend to go along with accessible coding, like well-structured documents and unique page titles and those sorts of things, they overlap a lot with search engine optimization. Another piece is that good accessibility relies on using JavaScript for progressive enhancement. So this is another one that helps all users because there's still a non-trivial amount of organizations that block JavaScript for security purposes. And so that type of development tends to help a lot of users who otherwise might see a blank page, or I can't tell you how many times we see pages where all the menus disappear if you're not using JavaScript. There's no warning that you're not seeing something, or everything looks fine, but you can't submit any forms, that kind of thing. So these types of things tend to help all people. The other thing is that, well, if people can find information on your site better and it's accessible for them, they're less likely to call your customer support line or that sort of thing, which to me is not the purpose of doing this, but it's an argument that speaks to the bottom line. And a lot of the bottom line metrics that decision makers and web managers tend to look at, like how long are people staying on the site, how many conversions are there, are people signing up for our email list, are they buying products, are they requesting information. A lot of those go up after you've made your site more accessible. So that's an argument we use very often. And one I wouldn't underestimate is the morale of developers. So developers tend to, especially in large institutions, are sort of, I have to tread carefully here because there's so many developers here, but they tend to be viewed as the implementers and not so much the decision makers or driving the process. And it's really a fulfilling, as a developer, it's really fulfilling to say, well, we did this because it was right and we figured it out. And it involves a lot of problem solving. So I'm not going to pretend that making a website, or especially a complex interactive website, accessible is easy. It's definitely doable. But it takes a lot of problem solving and creative thinking. And that is really, as a developer, I find that really fulfilling and sort of engaging. And that, with some of the corporations we've worked with, we've heard from them that their developers in general are a little bit happier now that they've sort of gone together and accomplished this piece they wanted to, and they're excited about it and they want to keep working on it. But it's also impacting their other work. Again, that's a hard one to quantify. It depends a lot on the organizational dynamics, but it shouldn't be underestimated. And then we can talk more later about sort of the mechanics of how we do our work, but the key thing for us is that to keep the benefits going, organizations need a champion within the organization. So hopefully that's someone high up who can say, look, this is important and we're going to do it. But it can also be someone who is just enthusiastic about this and cares about it and sort of keeps bringing it up. So that it's almost certain that accessibility benefits will be lost over time if there isn't a real champion with at least some decision-making ability in the organization. And the next is that you need internal accessibility guidelines and a process for reviewing and updating them. So what this all means basically is that it's not something that someone can do for you, or they can do it for you, but then in a few months, or maybe as little as 1 month or a year or something, all the benefits are going to be lost. So it's something that needs to happen and then become part of the workflow and the internal thinking. And our experience is that developers really love working on accessibility because for most people, unless you're in this field or you have a disability or a family member with a disability and you've sat with them while they've surfed the web or tried to check their bank account balance or something, you've never really thought about this. And that's perfectly normal and understandable, but it's really a sort of fun thing to work on. And so developers tend to be really into it, and it's more a matter of how do we institutionalize it, and for that, a champion is good and updatable documents. So thanks.
Thank you very much, John. I think one of the things that I often hear from people who want to make this happen is they equate this with the experience of the curb cut phenomenon, right? Where everybody argued against in the legislation for ADA the inclusion of universal curb cuts until they started getting put in and they realized that they benefited everybody, and that everybody really wanted to see them in, and it didn't have anything to do with the disabled community as much as it had to do with all of our ability to get around easier. On the websites, it's a similar phenomenon. When you do the work, it makes it easier for people to get around. It makes it easier for people to interact. But the difference with the curb cuts, it's a one-time investment. You do that and it's done. Here, it's an ongoing investment. Have you developed in your work, or how do you consult with companies around how much additional investment is it really to keep it involved? Is it more money from a technical perspective? Is it more process time? What guidance do you provide to companies?
It's absolutely true without a doubt that building accessibility in from the start when you're making an application is much less time and money than retrofitting it or trying to fix it later. So some of the organizations we work with, actually higher education institutions are a good example. They have tons and tons of pages, and a lot of them were put up by a biology professor in 1998 who had a web space, and now that's the biology department website and it was made with front page or something. And so we don't necessarily say, well, you should fix every page. If you have 40,000 pages and they're all really bad, it's not the best investment to fix every single page. It's just not practical, and it's not really going to provide the most benefit. So our general view is to, okay, let's get to a point where things are highly accessible where they need to be and as accessible as possible in other places, and then let's make sure everything that's new is accessible. And that is actually not a big time or money commitment. It's just a focus and commitment, a sort of, a mind commitment.
Well, I think I have 40,000 pages for my department alone here, but Tom actually does have 40,000 pages with LNS that he has to manage. And Tom, you engage a lot of people in trying to ensure that that content's accessible. Mm-hmm. And it's been an ongoing challenge for you. Why don't you describe a little bit how you engage the user community to make that possible?
Sure. So as Shel mentioned, I've been working for this group since 1995, and we've been doing, among other things, web design and application design for that entire period, with all the implications of the different eras of web design that implies. And I'd like to say that I came to a understanding and interest in web accessibility out of sort of deep-seated interest in social justice issues and things like that. But really, it was more accidental than that. That we were transitioning from being a group of geeks who also did web design to being a more professional web design shop, and hired our first application developer, a web developer, who was seriously in that role. Melanie Archer was her name. Some of you may have worked with her. And she happened to have a very strong personal emphasis on accessibility and really accuracy of code and adherence to standards. That's kind of where she came from, is that we have to have valid HTML, it has to be accessible and meet these guidelines and things. So I, as a manager of this group, I think one of the things that's interesting about accessibility is it's actually a topic that a lot of people can go from never having thought about to being in full support of very quickly. And we see that with our customers often, that often they haven't really considered that there are issues around accessibility with their websites. But when you bring it up with them, a good portion of them are immediately like, that makes total sense, and we want you to do this. So I made that transition pretty early in this process once we started real professional web development things. So that focus on standards compliance raised the awareness of the issue for me and for our customers. That there are two aspects to it. One is that we can say this is a federal requirement. We have Section 508, and you have to comply with this. The lawyers may not 100% agree with that, but we're able to sell that at least to departments. And it's and the moral obligation piece, that this is something that is just the right thing to do. And we're Berkeley. We have a lot of people who are very concerned with their moral obligations and social justice and such. And looked at through that lens, we've been able to have a lot of really productive conversations with people who are developing for. A couple of ways that it worked for us as an organization. So my group is mostly a recharge unit. So we charge departments for our work. And one of the ways that accessibility helped us is that it gave us some business advantages in that we were differentiated from many of the other options that departments had. Once we got them to understand that accessibility was an issue, then they were talking with, so there are basically three options for departments in LNS. They can use us, they can go to a third-party vendor, or they can hire the chair's nephew. And departments all choose those different options. There are sites of examples of those all throughout LNS. We can say, once we've raised the awareness of the issues, well, the chair's nephew really doesn't know how to do this. We have this expertise locally, and we can say, now that you think that this is a moral obligation for you, we can do it, and the chair's nephew probably can't. And really, a lot of the third-party web designers are not very up on it as well. When I've run job interviews for web developers, we've had to explain what Section 508 means. We'll ask a question, what do you think about, making websites compliant with Section 508? And probably 80% of the developers who come in don't know what that means at all. And then you bring up accessibility, and then they'll know what that means, at least to some extent, but they're clearly not versed in it. So from a business perspective, it's useful for us to be able to say, this is something that we think is really important to do on campus, and we have the expertise to do it, and a lot of your other options for doing this work will not be able to meet that need. The only concern that people tend to have is, what's it going to cost me? And as John mentioned, that is something that people will push back on. But it's really not very expensive to do. It's expensive to retrofit, but to build it in is really not very expensive. And part of the way we get around that pushback is we don't ask them. It's just how we design sites. We design them with accessibility in mind, and we don't charge you extra for the accessibility testing. It's part of our overall testing. And so partly people don't see it, but also it's really not an additional large expense that we incur as developing our sites and our applications, because it's just part of our process. So from the actual products that we create, there are some advantages. So the websites we're delivering, the applications we're delivering, clearly there's the advantages of having it accessible to larger groups of people, and not being sued is a good advantage. But beyond that, I think that having concern for accessibility indicates a more complete approach towards your development process. So there are three things that on campus are sadly lacking in most development processes, except everybody in this room, of course. One is consideration of the quality of the code. So much development happens that you've got your browser and it seems to work in IE7 and in Firefox 3.6, so it must be done, right? How much, what percentage of the code on campus is valid HTML? I don't know what that number is, but it's low. So the fact that you are paying attention to it brings you to a place where you're having your code is going to be higher quality, which means it's going to be more robust. It's going to work better in the future on IE8, IE9, Firefox 4, when those things come up. It's also putting you and your customers in a place where you're considering the needs of the audience. So John also talked about audiences, and we have heard the same comment that, well, our website, it's mostly for our staff and faculty, and nobody's disabled in that population. And that's, first of all, that can change. And the broken arm had nothing to do with the unicycle. It was, I fell downstairs in Tahoe, that's all it was. So I've had that experience of having several months where I had my right arm broken and having to use our sites, which worked just great, and other sites which were harder to work with. So your audience can change, but it opens up the conversation to say, okay, well, actually your audience isn't just the people on your staff and your faculty. When we look at your web stats, you're actually getting 80% of your hits from outside Berkeley. So, a big portion of your audience is potential students or general public, people who are interested in your discipline or your subject or your faculty. And that helps open up the conversation about what is the website for and how do we need to make it work for those different user groups. So having that, accessibility helps open up that conversation and make the process better. And the other thing that you need that is often lacking in development is testing procedures. So if you're going to be developing for accessibility, you're going to be going and looking at that. At the end, is this thing actually accessible? And we're also going to be looking at, is the code valid HTML? Does it work on these different browsers? So it's one more piece of what's in your acceptance procedures for your sites or for your applications. But the fact that you are doing it indicates that you actually have procedures and testing going on, which again, it brings that higher level of being able to say it's part of our professional development process, and it's a differentiator for how we're doing development versus some of your other options, which may look cheaper on paper because you're hiring a grad student to do it. You're not going to get the same type of product at the end of that. Then the other thing that has been a business advantage, I think, for us is that once you've set accessibility as a goal, then you're going to hire people like Caroline. I'm going to embarrass her here for a minute, who has a very strong focus on, Caroline knew what Section 508 was in the interview, but that's not specifically because she is, advocate for the disabled or anything. It's that she has a strong concern for doing things in the proper way, and whether that's making the code right, making it work on different browsers, different platforms. So you get, it's almost a proxy for a whole different mindset in a developer that I'm concerned about accessibility. So, and Caroline has been a great asset to us, and it so happened that we were getting into our accessibility efforts at around the same time that Diane Walker was starting the web access group for the first time. So we've been involved with that group since its inception, and it's been a very useful collaboration, I think. So that's been great. And then we produced 20, 25, 30 some departmental sites and applications, and so we've had a pretty big impact across our college over the years. And I think it's been, hard to quantify, yes. Can we say that, how many students avoided having to make a phone call to the office because they were able to find information on a website that they wouldn't have been able to find, before we redesigned it. We don't have any way to really measure those kinds of things, but it's clearly, in aggregate, I think that's a real major benefit for us. So
Tom, you pointed out the phenomenon of the chair's nephew. And in fact, the democratization of technology is empowering everybody to create, everybody to generate not just content, but applications, environments using tools on the web. How are you providing guidance to your communities that are doing this on their own around accessibility issues? Because it sounds like you're, from a business perspective, if they're buying your services, you're bundling it in. They get the benefit of your expertise in advance. But you don't want to suggest to them that they shouldn't do anything on their own. So have you found that accessibility is an issue for those individuals in leaving it out of their designs in the beginning?
Well, I think that it's something that you can bring up as a risk. So it may be that if you cobble something together using Google Sites and various other Google apps, it might wind up accessible. But if you're talking with a faculty member or chair or whoever who's got this project, do they have any way of assessing that? Are they going to know at the end whether they've created something that's going to be accessible? So, I'll bring it up as an issue, and it sometimes will change decisions. Sometimes, again, we'll make that distinction between, what my grad student can do versus what I'm going to get if I, engage in a more professional design process. It's not 100% successful. I mean, there's certainly, particularly on smaller scales where you're talking about a faculty lab or a particular academic project or research project that is trying, very specifically trying to do things kind of on the cheap. Some people still throw up their hands, but it's been pretty successful, I think, getting people at the at the departmental level and up to understand the issues, and whether or not they're contracting with my group, I think there's a lot more awareness of, oh, this is something at least I should be looking at.
So Bill, your challenge is a little bit different. Instead of working with end users, you often work with departments that have technologists in the department. You provide application development for both large-scale applications as well as departmental applications. What challenges do you have in representing this question of accessibility when working with departments who often already bring you pre-built technology and ask you to take it on, or partner with them in developing something new?
Right, and as John noted, it's a lot more expensive to retrofit when it's not built in up front. So really, I deal with the questions of accessibilities in two realms. One is as the chair of the IT Architecture Committee, and that is thinking about the problem on the more macro scale of how's a university, how with technology should we weigh in on this. And then the other is my day job, which is managing the web applications group. And so I'll back up just a minute, and a lot of what you guys were saying was really resonating with me. So in 2006, Diane Walker rang me up, and I had heard of Section 508 because we argued with PeopleSoft extensively and didn't seem to really sway them very far on it. So I was conversant with it, but my level of awareness was pretty superficial. And as Tom said, in a very short period of time, it's very easy for someone to make the case, if the other person's listening, for making stuff accessible. So at the end of that call, it was really clear, and I talked to all of the managers that work in the web applications group. We all agreed we were going to send someone to web access. A bunch of us signed up on the email list, and it seemed like this is something we can do. Like there's a lot in a large university in a complex environment we can't do to change the things we want to change, but this is something where we could really get engaged. So I think the big challenge is just really organizationally. You can make a commitment. And a lot of people make a commitment, and then the phone rings again, and 100 more emails come in that day. And the challenge is this is a commitment that has to be renewed, and it has to be renewed constantly. And that's why Lucy has been so valuable for us, because frankly, she emails Shell. Shell says, "Hey, Bill, what are you guys doing about this?" Or Lucy will email us, and she's been very generous about making the lab accessible. So we committed to we're sending every single one of the developers that's in our area, because we aren't able to hire people that necessarily are conversant with a lot of this. But that part of the expectation is that on the job they've got to learn how to do it, and then they're really psyched. And I think that the trend with technology supports the thing. As Shell was saying, technology is moving incredibly fast. I watched a video, you can Google it, find on TED Talks, the future of the user interface. Well, this is scaring me. We were having discussions about mobile technology. Well, this is about holographic, three-dimensional, stuff where your pen on the table can interact with the computer. That's going to bring a whole new realm of challenges. And so going back to the theme of constantly renewing this, if we're not constantly in contact with people like Lucy and people in the community, we're going to diverge. We're going to be still in circa 1999. Yeah, we were compliant in '99, but things have evolved. I think first there was 508, and then there was WCAS, the Web Content Accessibility Standards 1.0, which mapped to 508, and now there's 2, and I think 3 is in draft. So as the technology changes, we have to really stay engaged with that. And so, I'm going to get back to Shell's question. But when for us, it's the same. It's the question of costs. We'll get a customer who has a fixed budget. They have some flaming systems problem that they bring to us, and they want our help, and they want it to be for a predefined cost. And it might not have been on their radar. And so it's interesting because we take a very different approach than Tom's group. We'll put a line item in. We'll say, hey, accessibility, it's going to cost you. It's part of this. And it's kind of like, the university wasn't there with wheelchair ramps. Susie Castillo-Robeson told me some story about how the physical plant people, long time ago, didn't have ramps and all that stuff. And there was this huge lawsuit, and guess what? We all have ramps. You can get into pretty much any building here. Well, the web is it's a space. It's a way of interacting with the university that's fundamental, and we're just in the infancy of the web and of this technology. So, we think of, wow, how far it's come and, my phone and everything, but we're just at the beginning, which is slightly terrifying. So we have to be raising people's awareness. And so part of it is, we get accused of sticking the people with the bills and stuff, but they need to know that this is an important thing, and relatively speaking, it doesn't cost that much. When you consider that, I think John was looking, I Googled all the census figures too, and so I was figuring it's tens of millions of people who have visual and auditory impairment, and then when you couple in the mouse aspect of that it's affecting a huge population. And on a campus, then if I extrapolate it on just the student population, that's a couple thousand people that are impacted. And And it can happen to anybody, and I have a friend who's a VP at LexisNexis, and he lives in Colorado and makes killer salsa, and he brewed up a batch of this. He's crazy. And he brewed it up, and he opened up the top of the blender and put his head at the top to smell it, and he was blind for 2 days. And he re-experienced the world. And so that is there for us.
Blinded by salsa. Let me get that down.
So the truth is, though, I think as these guys have said, that
is that covered in 508?
salsa blindness, I don't know. But we can do a lot, and I think that, as people who have a lot of pressure on us, we can feel overwhelmed, and we can feel like not one more thing is getting onto my plate. And the truth is, if we just take a look at what's involved and walk a mile in those people's shoes, and that's why going to Lucy's lab is great. We maybe read a web page or two and think we know what we're doing, but until you go and watch someone use the technology, you really don't understand. I was laughing because initially, I think people tried to make our stuff accessible, and they'd type in, there's every Berkeley webpage, as Steve knows, has the little campanile at the top and stuff. And so on all of our systems, we had that logo, and we helpfully put campanile. So anytime someone who was using the assistive technology, every page, campanile, they were sick of the campanile, but until you really experience it from their perspective, and that doesn't take a lot of time. Campanile. Excellent.
At least it wasn't saying Hoover Tower.
And there's a real analogy between this issue and security. So we've done a lot of work with security. It has the same characteristics. There's policy and federal requirements, state requirements, and large lurking liabilities, and nobody wants to pay for it. And because it doesn't bring a perceived value to the perceived audience of the application. So we systematically looked at how to make a commitment to security, which is an unfunded mandate. And we created a program in ISD's web application unit called Secure by Design. And we did that a year and a half ago, and I've since seen, if you Google Secure by Design, I'm not sure we were first, but there's a lot of people doing that now. It's kind of a no-brainer. And we're doing the same thing today with accessibility. So we have a software development lifecycle that sort of specifies the steps that we go through. And up front, in the very beginning, we talk about how threat models work with security. At the same time, we talk about who are the users of this application, what are the types of things they're going to be doing, and we profile that and look at the accessibility. It's called accessible by design. We're not that creative. It works. We'll keep using it. So I guess I want to leave it open for some time for questions, but I'd just say one more thing on the hidden benefits side of this. As the technology evolves so quickly and things are moving so, dramatically, the pace is increasing as well. And the fundamental nature of the changes, when you think about the UI that's going to be in place, the user interface that's going to be around in 10 years, it's going to be radically different. I mean, they're talking about a device. You sit on a table that projects stuff around you. You don't really have a screen. You interact with your hands and your body with it. We have to be, and we're in the middle of transitioning to do standards-based development. So all of the development that we're doing today is based on open source, generally community-sourced, and sort of multi-entity kind of collaborative-based standards. And as long as we follow those, we're like 90% of the way towards accessible design. It's when we kind of just do stuff in a vacuum and don't try to adhere to those standards. When the standard comes out, there's a cost to learning it. But if we do that, the payoff is huge. So we've begun decoupling some of the way we present information from the data that's underneath it, from the logic. And that's sort of fundamental to software design today. But the dividend for that is when the new thing comes out, it's much easier to switch from one to the other. So we have that modularity there, and those are the things that also enable the people with the accessibility technology to use our stuff. So that's my answer.
I think you've heard a lot of great input today from our three panelists. We'd like to hear from the audience any questions that you have. I was sincere in my Stump the Panelist question. If you have a question for any of us on any topic related to accessibility, we have a mic we can pass around. But I'll start with something I didn't mention before. which I think is really relevant to this community, is for many years we designed things based on paper processes. And then we moved from those paper processes to basically being automated paper processes, right? We took the paper processes and we put them into technology and we said, hey, we automated them. But the current generation of students don't think in paper. They don't think in linear processes. They think in parallel terms. Everything's supposed to happen real time. It's supposed to happen all the time, 7 by 24, and it's supposed to happen concurrently. I mean, you know, if people are twittering what they had for lunch instead of telling you later when they see you what they had for lunch, it's a different world, right? Well, one of the things that we need to be considering is that's the up and coming generation, but one of our largest communities and largest audiences for our information is actually going to be in the elderly community. As we see more and more people coming back for education later in life, and that's the largest growth segment of the population. Many of the tools that the students may be designing today may not be applicable without accessibility built in for that same community, for the elderly community, when we want the same content to be available to both. So this isn't just a question of wanting to do the right thing. This is also a question of needing to do what our mission is about in dissemination of information. We've got to get to all of those audiences, and that's a real problem for us right now. That we haven't taken all of those communities into consideration in many of our designs. So I'd like to just have you think about in your own jobs, in your own world, where you're making decisions that may be really tuned to the current generation or the up-and-coming generation, trying to be this leading edge or bleeding edge as it's coming out with the holographic projectors. You know, when we have these broad diversities of communities, we still have to meet. And then your savings you may gain by trying to make something the latest and greatest is immediately lost when you then have to convert that into other things. You have other challenges. So open that up for questions. Anybody?
Raise your hand and I'll bring the microphone over.
Bill, you talk about developing new interfaces and systems as opposed to renovating old ones. Have you ever found that you've been discussing with departments the costs of propping up their old system versus creating a new one? Has accessibility been shown to save? I mean, the fact that they want you and they both want accessibility, and this version is much cheaper. Have you seen that kind of discussion and decision point? So that the question is that have we encountered departments where the older technology that they had was a lot cheaper to maintain, but it perhaps wasn't accessible, and then the cost of retrofitting that being an issue? Usually, by the time we're seeing a technology, look, central IT, we're pretty expensive. The number of really small departmental solutions we can provide is really dropped as we've been held to, the standards of financial accountability for recharge. And, we break even today, and that's it's an expensive, we're cheap compared to industry, but what I'm saying is, by the time they're coming to us, they usually have a pretty sizable problem, and usually we're talking about a large project. So as a percentage of the overall effort, in our area, we're not seeing that as a big problem. Where I think the issue is, though, for that, and the sweet spot that we can get to, is that many people built an application where a grad student or the nephew or someone built a system using some of the technologies that were available that have a very low barrier of entry. So many of the scripting languages, you can start learning a little HTML, and I guarantee you that any one of you can go to the web and you can learn, if you don't already know, a little HTML. You can learn enough in an afternoon to put up a good, probably ugly, but okay-looking web page that'll get across what you want to convey. It's another afternoon to begin writing code, using some of those frameworks. So a lot of people had jumped in, and their department needed something, a legitimate need that wasn't met in the center of the organization that they were able to build rapidly. And then now they have 40,000 of those things. But they're not truly an application the way we think of them today. And meanwhile, in the rest of the world, technology has caught up, and we have things like SharePoint, like Drupal, like Google Docs, like Office Live type things. So there's a lot of tools that are available, either that we can run locally, like Drupal and SharePoint, or things that are run out in the cloud. And most departments will be looking to move those little tactical applications that they had or aggregate into something like SharePoint, which is a perfectly good way of dealing with it, because they don't really need to get into an expensive software development project. So the answer to the question of how these people will encounter accessibility is those platforms must be accessible. So, there's a lot of activity in the open source community among Berkeley people. There's a large those people have to be involved in the Drupal, discussions at the national level, and they are. And that's leading towards, the platform being designed for accessibility. Microsoft is deeply aware of the issue, and we negotiate, campus-level agreements, and I'm sure Shell can speak to strategic sourcing. Accessibility is part of what we put on the table. In fact, ITAC is working and has been working for a while on accessibility standards to be built into every RFP where we're seeking some kind of agreement with a vendor. And it's the VPAT. So it's about scoring the RFP and making the vendor actually put their true position on the line and holding them accountable if they're bending the truth. And we're holding them. We will hold them to that.
Virtually every vendor will respond with a check mark, yes, their software is accessible, because they don't know what you're asking, and if they know they put a yes in that column, it's better for them. But in fact, we're getting far more sophisticated and nuanced in the way we're asking and what we're asking. We're evaluating a product right now that we would be interested in providing a site license for to the whole campus community. Not passing accessibility, not going to be given the opportunity. Right? So they're going to lose the business opportunity if they can't modify their product, and they can't guarantee in contractual language that they will make their product, VPET standard or otherwise accessible. And this is not an exceptionally sophisticated problem. It's something that, particularly for smaller vendors, they're unaware of the business opportunity. And so you need, one of our obligations as a public institution and an educational institution is to raise that visibility, not just for our own community, but for the market as a whole. Lucy?
I just wanted to respond to that a little bit by saying, once we've done that work for that vendor and they've come back and made an accessible product, we're not holding that accessible product hostage. It's going out into that marketplace, and everybody else is getting that accessible product.
Right.
The more we take that effort here, as a public institution, it's our obligation. Berkeley's taken the lead for many, many years on accessibility. A lot of people say that Berkeley is the home of the accessible world, and it's because we here at Berkeley do things like that. The more we work with vendors to make things accessible, and the more we say, we won't buy your product if it's not accessible, the more everybody, not only here, but all over the world, will benefit from our work.
So John, I wanted to follow up on the previous question around retrofit. When you're providing consulting, how often do your clients choose to retrofit versus understand the learnings from the experience and then just go into a rewrite process?
I'd say it depends on the size of the application or site in question. So for instance, on one extreme, if you have 100,000 pages and they're all static HTML, well, they're probably not going to retrofit the whole thing. So it really depends on, part of it is the scope of our consulting agreement too. Generally, we're not, if you have 100,000 pages, we can't review all of them, because by the time we finished, it would be obsolete anyway, and it would cost you a fortune. So we tend to focus on percentages of sites based on most used features, most important features, most, hitting every template, that kind of thing. And so for most clients, it's usually a sort of in-between path where we prioritize things for them and say, look, this is really important. If you don't do this, you're totally inaccessible, you're losing lots of visitors. And then we try to set them on a path of retrofitting older stuff where possible, and then making sure everything new is accessible. And like I said before, the real, when we feel we've been really successful, is the development team is on board, the marketing and executive teams are on board, and so accessibility becomes a part of the institutional culture. And then enforcement is, I mean, we're not an enforcement agency, but enforcement is really a non-issue because some of the groups we worked with in our grant-funded program, they still call us. You know, they were 2 or 3 years ago, and they say, well, you know, we got this video player, and we're trying to do HTML5 and get ready for that, but we have these Flash problems, and so what's the best way to do this now, and then what's the best way to plan for the future? And so that's when we say, okay, they're really getting it, they're thinking about it, they're getting new technologies and thinking about how it will work with that. And that's about as much as we can ask for, because you can't just say, well, it's accessible, now we're done, or we'll just do this forever. Every time we post a video, we'll do this, because then you're sort of missing the whole point.
Other questions? Here in the middle and up front.
Another contributor, I think, to the phenomenon of the dean's uncle is the distributed nature at UC Berkeley, where every department, every unit has their own ivory tower carefully defended against all borders. And there's not, for many of these things, any kind of central support system, any central knowledge base, central tools. LNS, within LNS, has the great services of Tom and Caroline and company, and even there you get a few dean's uncles building things. How can or is the university making information, making tools and technologies and assistance available to these many small places where we've got accidental webmasters building things based on front page and other great stuff of 10 years ago?
I think the problem, the heart of that problem is a combination of the lethargy of change within higher education matched against the extraordinarily evolving pace of change in technology, right? So even 15 years ago, when some of these comments we were talking about the age of technology, then you were designing in a client-server world. You were dealing with change being a function of major dot releases of Windows, or essentially things that did get measured in months or even potentially years. We're looking at, if you had said to somebody 15 weeks ago that Flash was going to maintain its dominance and that HTML5 was an emerging standard, and you have that same conversation today, you'd have two entirely different conversations, right? In 15 weeks. Not to mention, competing ads and fighting marketing pitches between Adobe and Apple and Google and others. The evolution is so fast. Then you apply that to the campus and you say, okay, we're going to offer a common solution, a standard solution for the entire campus. In order to do that, that solution has to evolve at the fastest rate that the slowest mover can handle. Well, the slowest mover in higher ed, let me tell you, I've got some Emeriti faculty who I think we still print out their emails on memo format and give them the 3-part carbon paper because that's what they're comfortable with and that's what they want to work with. I haven't seen a mimeograph machine running lately. I miss the purpling smell, but I'm sure somewhere in this institution we have them. It's important to recognize that because that does limit the ability of the leading edge to continue to leverage a common solution. They basically end up having to break free from the anchor of the common solution that's tied to the slowest mover. So we have to basically parse our solutions up into slow mover, medium tier, and early adopter, rather than a common solution. Well, to do that, it's more expensive. If you're going to have 3 tiers, it's more expensive than offering one option. Corporations and enterprises don't do that. Do you want black or black as your color, right? I mean, you get one option, usually, because it's the cheapest thing to do. They can give you one thing, they can put all the investment into that, and they can make it work very well at a relatively low cost, and sometimes an extremely low cost. In our case, if we attempted to do that, we would not get enough of the community. So what we have to decide as an organization is how much is the benefit of that lower cost? And how much can we get adoption in principally the middle tier? How much can we expand the middle tier? And recognize that we're going to have to orphan the slowest mover sooner than we ever would have before. And we're going to have to embrace allowing the leading edge to churn faster without impacting the middle. It's a different mindset and a different financial model and a different approach, but one I believe we're going to have to embrace if we want to get more cost effective. And within that cost effective, you can then offer things like accessibility by design and secure by design because it's part of the platform, it's part of the framework. If you don't do that, we're leaving it to every individual to choose their own, which inevitably means their path to solution will often not include accessibility because they're just trying to get the job done. So unless we can get everybody trained and keep up with the skills. So I think it's a very complex and challenging question. I think we have time for one more. There was one up here in the front. Can we pass the microphone forward, Dave?
This is a practical question. I would like to know a brief answer to the, hopefully there is accessibility built into these products that I'm going to mention. Mm-hmm. Drupal is number one. Do you feel basically?
You probably know.
Yeah, so, well, as a long answer, it depends how you use it. It depends how you present it.
I can give you
a
short answer within the Berkeley context, which is right before I came over here, because I knew this was just going to come up. I ran the tester, one of the testers that's recommended, against ist.berkeley.edu, and we passed. Now, is that's sort of anecdotal?
So
it's not a systematic.
It's possible.
It is possible.
It's possible, yeah.
Definitely.
Okay.
But it's also possible to make it inaccessible as well. It's
Yeah,
not, the product won't drive you to accessibility.
The thing about Drupal is it's so modularized. So you're gonna install, if you've got a complicated site, you may have 10, 15, 20 different custom modules that you're putting in there, and those may or may not be accessible. I think the core trunk is fine.
So right now, the platform support for Drupal is in my team. And so one of the things that is our responsibility for running the campus Drupal platform, which will be released this fiscal year, is that the modules that we review and approve must be accessible.
And there's
So
a list
Caroline,
of
you
those
had a-
somewhere.
So there's also within Drupal an accessibility group that I'm a member of, and Drupal as the Drupal community has been very responsive to accessibility questions, and so there is for modules a new thing, an accessibility pledge. I don't know if you're a Drupal user, you've probably seen the Drupal 7 pledge, because upgrading to Drupal 6 was such a nightmare because the modules weren't ready. Module developers are now pledging that they will be ready for Drupal 7. We are also now rolling out an accessibility pledge so that if you see that badge on a module, you will know that the developer is committed to making that module accessible. And this will also be for themes, et cetera.
Great.
One more product, or one more type of product, because I try to get people away from these things. Front page and Word converted to HTML. Can those be?
Caroline is screaming. It's certainly you can create accessible sites with those products, but it takes more work than the people who are using those products are likely to be able or willing to do.
Thank you.
Okay. With that, I'll turn it back over to Lynn.
Okay, great. Thank you. I want to thank the panel, Shel, John, Bill, and Tom, for coming and speaking with us today. Give them a hand. I'd also like to thank all of you for coming and attending, listening to this very, very important issue that affects really all of us. So with that, I'm calling the meeting to a close, and see you in September. Look for email. Wait. Video for this, I've been told, may take a week and a half to go through final production and getting it ready for the web. So I will send out email to all of the lists saying when it is available, and it will be on the WebNet site in probably forever, in some location, and I will give you the URL for that. Thank you very much.